Well, thank you for joining us for the 2025 Michigan Notable Books Author Conversation. My name is Zandra Blake. I am the engagement team leader at the East Lansing Public Library, and I'm also a member of the Michigan Notable Books Committee. With us today is Jeffrey Wilson, author of the book We Live Here. We have just a few questions to ask. Are you ready, Jeffrey?
I'm ready. Yeah. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate this.
Oh, thank you for being here. First question is, give us some background on yourself. How did you become a writer?
Yeah. So my writing really began with my master's thesis. So I did my master's at Columbia University, New York City, in anthropology, and I took a class there that really forced me to think about how to write differently. So I write in graphic novel or comic book form is how I write. So the class pushed me to think about, well, what are the different ways that we can write? What are the different ways that we can try to engage audiences that might be beyond sort of academia, right? Like we gather
Hmm.
up all this awesome data and information, but oftentimes they're behind paywalls of academic journals and oftentimes in sort of language that people that's kind of dense, hard to get into. So the class really pushed me to think about what are the ways that we can write anthropology or ethnography in a way that appeals to broader audiences. So from that class and sort of those ideas developed there, I I went and I was in New York City, moved to Tucson, Arizona. I was teaching classes there. I was teaching an intro to anthropology class, and I had a class on social movement. And I was like, well, wouldn't it be cool if I could talk to someone like Noam Chomsky, who's a well-known political intellectual, famous for his work on language. I was like, wonder if I could talk to him about social movements and maybe just bring this into my class, like a short kind of 20-minute interview or something like that. So through various friends, I was able to reach out to Chomsky, set up an interview. And I quickly realized that that interview could also be a comic book, right? So that was my first book, Instinct for Cooperation, interview with Noam Chomsky. So I took that sort of experience from my Columbia University class, and then I wrote this book, this interview with Chomsky. And the Chomsky interview, Chomsky's sort of dry in terms of like how he talks generally, but there's a lot of information in each sentence. So essentially, what I did was like break off various things that he talked about, and I went and interviewed other people. So, for example, he mentions, we're talking about Occupy Wall Street, and we're talking about New York City, and talking about the library actually that developed in Zuccotti Park. There's this
Hmm.
huge library that was built and ultimately destroyed. But so he's talking about sort of the removing of books from Zuccotti Park, and he says, well, Tucson knows all about that. And at the time, this is 2011, Tucson, Arizona was banning Mexican American studies. So they had passed a law that said that you can't teach anything that teaches ethnic solidarity. And they went after the Mexican American Studies program in Tucson. So from that sentence from Chomsky, I then went and interviewed teachers and students that were involved in the Mexican American Studies program. So that book then sort of is a comic book also, but it weaves Chomsky's interview with these other types of interviews, sort of jumping off what Chomsky says and goes into sort of detail about what he was talking about. So really that started sort of my writing career, I guess, outside of academia,
Hmm.
in terms of writing comic books. So that was uh, my first book, and then my second one is We Live Here, about
All
trade
right.
eviction defense. Yeah.
So you've kind of touched on this a little bit already, but I'll ask anyway. Why do you write, and what is your writing process?
Yeah, so I definitely come out of like a social justice analyzing social justice movements. So that is definitely why I write. I'm interested in how and why people come together and the struggles that they're involved in. Also because I'm involved in these struggles also, right? So it's not like they're necessarily separate from what I do. So that's really why I write: commitment to social justice. And really the writing process for me is a little bit different than writing a normal book, right? I don't
Mm-hmm.
sit down and just sort of write. So my process involves sort of like an academic background. So I do what's called ethnography. So I like to go into a place, live there, get to know people, be involved with the movements, and then write about them. So all my books are interview based. So I do these in-depth interviews with people, and the Detroit Eviction Defense book is based on a series of 7 interviews that I did. So I take those interviews, and then sorry, one second. I take those interviews, right? So I have the interview, sort of chunks of interviews, and then I go and I look for visual information, right? Visually rich information within the text so that I can bring it out into a comic book. I then take those interviews and I create a panel by panel outline of what I want the page to be. So each panel I lay out, I design the panels. So I'll say like, I want a shot of this person looking this way, looking up at something, and there'll be like this text will be in it. So I developed that sort of side of it, right, which is like a very visual panel by panel sort of outline. And then I have a script also that goes with it, right? So like
Mm-hmm.
this is going to be the line that's going to go in this panel. And then I hand both of those off to the illustrator. And then the illustrator comes up with what they call pencils. So just
Mm-hmm.
pencil sketches of that. And then we have a conversation with the illustrator, talk about what works, what doesn't work, and the illustrator goes and brings that to life. So that's the process. So it's a very
Mm-hmm.
involved, like step-by-step
Yeah.
process. And it is one of the reasons why it takes a very long time to write these books also. So,
Right.
yeah.
So how did you get the idea for your book, We Live Here?
The idea really, I mean, so the We Live Here is based on my PhD fieldwork. So I went into my PhD fieldwork thinking about, um, again, the idea of like, how do I make this work accessible to a broader audience, right? So I was sort of following 2 paths when I went into my PhD fieldwork. One was like the academic writing, right,
Mm-hmm.
for the PhD, but then I did on sort of another or parallel tracks. I was like, well, I also want this to be a comic book. So every interview that I did, I told them like, hey, this is going to be for this, but also potentially for this, right? So for my PhD, but also for this comic book. Um, so that's really, yeah. I don't know. Am I answering your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So that's kind of how I came into the work then.
Mm-hmm.
Um, through via my PhD fieldwork, which was a culmination of about 2 years worth of work in Detroit,
Mm-hmm.
working with the group Detroit Eviction Defense. And again, for me, it isn't about being an outsider, just sort of looking in. I went and was involved with the group, right? So I built those relationships. I was involved in the struggles with the group. Um, and also like this, like the ideas of housing justice weren't foreign to me. I mean, obviously
Mm-hmm.
different, right? Different place.
Mm-hmm.
I'm from Lansing. I owned a home at the time in Lansing. I was underwater on the home at the time, given like when I had bought it and the state of the real estate market and the fact that they had given somebody that worked at a bookstore a mortgage, the kind of
Mm-hmm.
predatory lending stuff that was happening before 2008.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, the prospect of losing the home, although I didn't, right, uh, was always there. So it's like the housing justice stuff wasn't a foreign thing to me. So I felt like I was working in solidarity with people in a lot
Mm-hmm.
of ways when I was in Detroit.
So, how would you define this work?
I really define this work as a kind of graphic novel scholarship, ethnographic scholarship, I would call it. Um, it's really, it kind of falls in between, right? It's not
Mhm.
entirely scholarship, right? Although I do use footnotes and like I have an intro that's more scholarly and like um, uh, an appendix in the back that's pretty scholarly also. Um, so I'd call it like I would call it graphic novel scholarship, right? And this is sort of
Mhm.
a field that is emerging. I believe the University of Toronto has part of their press has an ethnographic book series that they print. And the idea of using comic books as a mode to communicate research, I think within the last 10 or 15 years, uh,
Mhm.
has become more and more popular. More people are talking about it in terms of a form to write in. So, yeah, I would call it that. I mean, it's kind of in between scholarship, graphic novels, journalism, also, I would say,
Right.
really
Mhm.
formed kind of journalism.
Mm.
I'm definitely following the tradition of people like Joe Sacco,
Mhm.
who is a comic book, really at the forefront of comic book journalism. He's written a book on Palestine. He's written a book about Gaza. He was in Sarajevo, I believe, sort of a war correspondent, kind of reporter. Um, so really kind of following that tradition, I would say.
Okay. Okay. The next question is, what are your favorite characters or moments from your book?
Yeah, so the book is really a celebration of
Mhm.
of Detroit and the people in Detroit. I really wanted to hedge against this idea of a post-apocalyptic Detroit. You know what I mean? Of
Mhm.
just a Detroit that goes in and sort of celebrates ruin. And I wanted to write a book that reinforced the idea that people were in the city and people lived there and people were fighting back against the things that were happening.
Mhm.
So at the core, really, the book is about celebration of people fighting back. And what the book does is it follows seven people through their sort of journey of fighting back against mortgage foreclosures within the city. So Detroit experienced sort of two waves of foreclosures. So, on the one hand, you have the 2008 economic housing crisis, right, which Detroit sort of experienced a little bit before, and then ran into 2008. And then after that, in 2011, 2012, you have a tax foreclosure crisis, right? So you have
Mhm.
the city foreclosing on a number of different houses via these tax foreclosures. So in writing the book, I sort of had to decide, am I going to follow the tax foreclosure track or the mortgage foreclosure track? And the book follows mortgage foreclosures. Um, so it's seven different people that faced mortgage foreclosure, fought back, and won their home back against these banks that were trying to foreclose on them. So I mean, there's so many great stories in there. I would say one of my favorite stories in the book. Um, and these are all people I know, so it's a little weird to call them characters. you know,
Right.
uh, but I learned so much from the people that I was interviewing. Right, like it
Mhm.
wasn't so much that I was this scholar putting my analysis on it. It was much more I'm the learner and they're teaching me about what's happening, right? Uh,
Right.
and a really good example of that is the story of Marie Sims. So the process, I try to built in kind of equity into the process because one thing I don't want to do is go into Detroit and just take stories out and then leave and write books. You know what I mean? I want to
Mhm.
be
Mhm.
extractivist in that sense. So way I tried to sort of hedge against that was to um, bring the people I interviewed back into the conversation into creating the book, right? So I mentioned this idea of pencils in a stage in doing this. So I'd
Mhm.
send the pencils to the people I interviewed, right? And be like, hey, what do you think about how I'm depicting your story? What did I get right? What did I get wrong? let me know what's happening here.
Mm-hmm.
But I sent that off to Marie, and Marie was great. She was like, yeah, it looks good. And I was expecting like little tweaks like, oh, this didn't look like this, or this didn't happen here. But Marie had a much more like fundamental critique of what was happening. She was very much like, um, um, she was very much like, you got everything right, but you didn't bring in the deeper history, right, of my story. So I was like, oh, well, what does that mean? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
She's like, well, I grew up in this neighborhood called Black Bottom in Detroit, right? And Black Bottom is a really famous neighborhood in the city, or was a famous neighborhood in the city um, that Black folks lived in, right? So it was like the central neighborhood, but in the 1960s, it was bulldozed
Right.
to put a highway through.
Mm-hmm.
So for Marie, and Marie lived in that neighborhood growing up. So she was one of the families that was displaced via this urban renewal program, right? So for Marie, her housing struggles just weren't about her contemporary housing struggles. It was really this deeper history of displacement that she wanted to tell. And it wasn't simply about her losing her childhood home. She wanted to emphasize that there was a community there, right? A vibrant community in which there were Black owned grocery stores and doctors, and there were clubs there. And this is the neighborhood where Joe's Records was, and where Aretha
Mm-hmm.
Franklin recorded her first recording. Her dad's a
Right.
famous preacher in this city, and he was one of the first people to record his sermons onto vinyl. And it was done at Joe's Records and in Black Bottom. So essentially, unbeknownst to me, like I sort of had decontextualized her story, right? I had focused
Mm-hmm.
too much on the individual and not enough on that larger history. So Marie really taught me that I needed to bring that history back in. So I was like, oh, you're totally right. This is a misstep on my part. Let's talk again, and then you tell me what you want me to bring in. So for her story, then I added in 3 or 4 more pages that brings in that deeper history, right? That
Mm-hmm.
deeper history of displacement. And it's a really important point, because these ideas of displacement aren't simply about what happened right now, right? These are legacies of displacement that people have faced over and over and over again. And with Marie's help, I was able to bring that back in. So, yeah, my favorite character, I know that's maybe doesn't get added. One of my favorite moments of doing the book was
Mm-hmm.
sort of those deeper enriched conversations that we were having around it. So, yeah.
Thank you. Um, what did it mean to have your work selected as a Michigan notable book?
I mean, it's a great honor. I mean, first, right, to be one of 20 books in the state of Michigan, to be selected was really great. The people that I was selected with are all amazing, amazing works. The reception that you all held, I felt like was really great. A really nice way of sort of recognizing the book, because oftentimes when you write these books, you write them, they sort of go out into the world, and then nothing, unless you're pretty active, like setting up
Mm-hmm.
tours and that kind of stuff, which with small children and all that kind of stuff doesn't happen. So it was really nice to have an event and sort of recognize the story. I also think it's, especially in these times that we're living in, I think it's really important. These public spaces, public libraries are amazing. You know, speech and education are all under attack. So um, I feel like having a space where we all came together and sort of recognized works and were able to talk about it in sort of a public space, right, was really great via the Library of Michigan. So it was a real honor to have my book selected.
Great. So, why do you think people should read your book?
Um, well, I think there's a few reasons that people should read the book. One, what I've learned um, from Detroit is that what's happening in Detroit or happened in Detroit is often a testing ground for stuff that will happen later on, right? in the broader
Mhm.
sort of context of the country. So, you could look at any different number of things, but, the unelected, um, sort of the unelected emergency manager that came in, right, that had power over all the elected officials in Detroit, sort of that usurpation of sort of democratic processes, right? Um,
Mhm.
kind of moves towards authoritarianism. I think Detroit was sort of early in these sort of conversations of this happening. So I feel like Detroit's always, and also the water privatization that Kevin Orr was trying to implement in the city, those kinds of things. I mean, things happen in sort of these cities first and then get dispersed throughout the country, right? So I think
Mhm.
that Detroit is always an important place to look at historically. So there's that sort of side of it. The other part of it that I think is particularly important is that, as I said, the book is a celebration of the people living in the city. And it's also a celebration of tactics, right? It's a celebration of people coming together, people organizing with their communities, people organizing with their neighbors, right? And I feel like that is one of the key lessons that needs to be taken away from this book, right?
Mhm.
Is that you should read the book for what community self-defense looks like, right? And I feel like as we're sort of moving as sort of as sort of authoritarian tendencies are rising in the country, right? Um, these lessons from Detroit, these lessons of how mutual aid work, how solidarity practically work, are going to become absolutely crucial in defending our communities. Um, so there's sort of that part of it. There's also the part of it too where, one thing that I learned from people in DED was that the sentiment that no politician is going to come and save you, right? Like you're not waiting for some elected official to come in and make everything right. These things need to be sorted out by you and your communities, and you need to organize with the people around you in order to do it. So I think the kind of like the ways in which sort of the direct action and the mutual aid were developed, I think are really important. And I think we're kind of in a spot right now, also just generally in the country, that it feels like no politician is really coming in to save us or fix anything. So we need to start thinking locally. We need to start thinking about the people around us. And I think that those are absolutely key lessons to be drawn from the book.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Which writers or works have you found yourself reading lately?
I am teaching 4 classes right now. So I am reading, and I'm teaching a new class, Geography of Latin America. So I have been reading a lot about Latin America, and specifically, I'm reading a lot about the Mexican Revolution. So nothing all that really exciting in terms of like actual works to point to. Although the history of the Mexican Revolution, I think, is really important to think about because I often think that our geographies in the United States is often a geography of east to west, and we don't think about the geography of south to north that much, or north to south, right? So
Mhm.
something as historic as the Mexican Revolution often gets separated out from U.S. history, like it happened over there, and we don't think about it.
Mhm.
But I think there are a lot of lessons. There are a lot of parallels to sort of what happened in the Mexican Revolution and sort of how things are happening here right now in the country. Um, so yeah, I'm reading Mexican about the Mexican Revolution right now. As I teach sort of about as I teach about as I use these different movements to think about the history and the geographies of Latin America, essentially. And one thing I try to do is I try to teach a historically deep, geographically broad analysis of what's happening. So, yeah, this week we're going to sort of look at Mexico and think about how Mexico has developed out from the Mexican Revolution and how that's impacted its geographies. Today. So,
All right.
yeah,
Well, that was my last question. Thank you so much.
thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Yeah, it was a great honor to be part of this and appreciate your time.
Oh, Same here, and just want to thank the audience too. You will be able to view this on michigan.gov/notable books website. So this will be available soon, as well as other author talks that we've had. And again, thank you for joining us, and have a good day. Thank you.